The bus wheezed to a stop outside Fort Meridian Training Facility, its brakes hissing like an angry serpent in the pre-dawn darkness. Among the flood of nervous recruits stepping onto the gravel, Kira Vasquez barely registered as more than a shadow. At 5 feet 2 inches and weighing barely 110 pounds, she moved with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to being overlooked. The other recruits towered around her, their voices already forming the aggressive bonds that military training demanded. Marcus Thorne, a mountain of muscle from Texas, surveyed the group with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His eyes skipped over Kira entirely, dismissing her as inconsequential. Sergeant Briggs emerged from the facility like a storm cloud given human form, his voice cutting through the morning air with practiced brutality. "Line up, maggots. Welcome to the place where dreams come to die and warriors are forged from the ashes." Kira found herself positioned between two recruits who seemed to dwarf her even more in the harsh fluorescent lighting. The recruit to her left, Amanda Chun, glanced down with barely concealed disbelief. "This has got to be some kind of mistake," Amanda whispered to her neighbor, loud enough for Kira to hear. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed similar acts of courage in your own community, where someone surprised everyone with hidden strength. Sergeant Briggs began his inspection, moving down the line with the methodical precision of a predator selecting prey. When he reached Kira, his steps slowed. He studied her for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing. "What do you weigh, recruit?" 110 pounds, Sergeant," Kira replied, her voice steady despite the snickers rippling through the ranks behind her. Briggs shook his head slowly. "I have seen scarecrows with more meat on their bones." He continued down the line, but the damage was done. The whispers began immediately, spreading like wildfire through the formation. "Deadweight," someone muttered from the back. "She will not last a week," another voice added. Kira remained perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed straight ahead. But those who looked closely might have noticed something unsettling in her absolute stillness. It was not the frozen terror of someone overwhelmed, but rather the controlled calm of a predator deciding whether the threat was worth acknowledging. Her hands, small but marked with calluses that spoke of years of disciplined training, remained relaxed at her sides. The morning sun began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the training facility. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of artillery practice rumbled like distant thunder, a reminder that this place was designed to transform civilians into something harder, something capable of surviving what others could not. Sergeant Briggs finished his inspection and turned to address the group. "You have exactly 60 seconds to grab your gear and report to Barrack C. Anyone who is late gets to explain themselves to Instructor Kane. And trust me, that is not a conversation you want to have on your first day." The recruits scattered like startled birds, but Kira moved with purpose rather than panic. She shouldered her pack with an efficiency that spoke of muscle memory, her movements economical and precise. As she walked toward the barracks, she could feel the weight of judgment following her every step. Barrack C reeked of industrial disinfectant and the nervous sweat of 43 recruits trying to claim their piece of military real estate. Kira entered to find the prime bunks already taken, the recruits having formed natural alliances based on size, swagger, and shared disdain for anyone who looked like they might slow down the group. Marcus Thorne had positioned himself as the unofficial leader, his massive frame sprawled across a lower bunk near the window. He watched Kira navigate toward the remaining spots with the amused detachment of someone watching a child try to reach something on a high shelf. "Look what the army dragged in," he announced to his growing circle of followers. "I have seen bigger kids at elementary school recess." Amanda Chin laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the barracks chatter. "Seriously, what is she supposed to do if we actually see combat? Hide behind us and hope the enemy doesn't notice her?" The laughter spread through the barracks like a contagion. Even recruits who might have normally kept their opinions to themselves found themselves joining in, desperate to avoid becoming targets themselves. Kira methodically arranged her gear on the thin mattress, her movements betraying nothing of what she might be feeling. Jake Morrison, a lanky farm boy from Nebraska, leaned against his bunk post with false confidence. My little sister could probably take her in a fight, and she is only 12 years old. I bet she cries during the first PT test, added another voice from across the room. Probably gets a medical discharge by week 2. The cruel speculation continued as Kira finished organizing her belongings. Her few possessions fit easily into the small metal locker, leaving plenty of empty space that somehow made her seem even smaller in this environment designed for larger, louder people. Sergeant Briggs appeared in the doorway like an approaching storm. Listen up, children. In exactly 30 minutes, you will report to Training Ground Alpha for your initial assessment. This is where we separate the wheat from the chaff, the soldiers from the civilians who thought they could play dress-up. His eyes found Kira in the crowd, and his expression suggested he had already made his assessment. Some of you will discover today that military service is not for everyone. There is no shame in recognizing your limitations early. The message was clear, and the other recruits absorbed it eagerly. As Sergeant Briggs left, the whispers resumed with renewed enthusiasm. Did you see how he looked at her? Marcus asked his growing audience. Even the drill sergeant knows she does not belong here. Amanda nodded sagely. I heard they have quotas to fill now. Probably why they are letting anyone in, regardless of whether they can actually do the job. The conversation shifted to speculation about what would happen when the real training began. Stories circulated about previous recruits who had washed out, each tale becoming more exaggerated with each telling. Through it all, Kira sat on her bunk, lacing her combat boots with the precise, practiced movements of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. A younger recruit named David Park ventured a tentative comment. Maybe we should not judge too quickly. Sometimes people surprise you. The barracks fell silent for a moment before Marcus let out a booming laugh. Right, kid? Maybe she is secretly a ninja or something. He made exaggerated martial art gestures that sent the room into fresh waves of laughter. Kira finally looked up from her boots, meeting Marcus's eyes across the room. For just an instant, something flickered in her gaze that made him pause. But the moment passed so quickly that he convinced himself he had imagined it. She stood and walked toward the door, her small frame moving through the crowd of larger recruits who parted without thinking, the way people unconsciously step aside for someone carrying something dangerous. Where are you going, Tiny? Amanda called out. Planning your escape route already? Kira paused at the threshold. Just getting some air before training, she replied quietly. As she disappeared into the corridor, the laughter resumed behind her. But some of the recruits found themselves oddly unsettled. There had been something in her voice, something that did not match her diminutive appearance. But in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the barracks, surrounded by the pack mentality of group mockery, such observations were quickly dismissed. Training Ground Alpha stretched before the recruits like a concrete monument to human suffering. Obstacle courses snaked through the morning mist, their metal bars and rope climbs gleaming with dew that would soon mix with sweat and tears. Instructor Kane stood at the center of it all, a weathered monument of muscle and scar tissue, who had earned his reputation breaking recruits who thought they were tougher than they actually were. Welcome to your first reality check, Kane announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived things these recruits could not imagine. Today we find out who belongs here and who should have stayed home with their teddy bears. The recruits formed ragged lines, their earlier bravado evaporating under Kane's withering gaze. Kira found herself positioned near the back, where the larger recruits had unconsciously pushed her during the formation. First exercise, push-ups to failure, Kane barked. When you cannot do another one, you stay down and we count how pathetic you really are. Marcus Thorne dropped into position with the confidence of someone who had spent years in his high school weight room. His massive arms pumped out repetition after repetition, each one accompanied by a grunt of exertion that seemed designed more for show than necessity. Around him, other recruits struggled to match his pace. Amanda Chun managed 37 before her form began to deteriorate, her face flushed with effort and embarrassment as she watched Marcus continue past 50. Jake Morrison collapsed at 28, his farm boy strength failing him in ways that shocked his rural confidence. Kira maintained perfect form through 40 push-ups, her small frame moving with mechanical precision. Her breathing remained controlled, her technique flawless. But as she continued past 45, then 50, the other recruits began to notice. "How's she still going?" Amanda whispered to Jake, who was now sitting cross-legged on the ground, nursing his bruised ego. "Probably weighs nothing," Jake replied, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Kane watched Kira with growing interest as she passed 60 push-ups without any visible signs of fatigue. Her form remained textbook perfect, her breathing steady. When she finally stopped at 73, it was not because her muscles had failed, but because she seemed to make a conscious decision to end the exercise. "Interesting," Kane muttered, making a note on his clipboard. The next exercise was rope climbing, where Kira's light weight became an obvious advantage. While the heavier recruits struggled to haul their bulk up the thick rope, she ascended with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the technique. Her small hands gripped the rope with surprising strength, her legs locking and releasing in a rhythm that spoke of extensive training. Marcus managed to reach the top through sheer brute force, but his descent was awkward and exhausting. Kira, by contrast, controlled her descent with precision, her movements economical and efficient. "Lucky break," Marcus panted as he landed heavily beside the rope. "Being tiny has its advantages, I guess." But when they moved to the combat dummy strikes, the dynamic shifted again. This exercise required technique over size, and Kira's small fist delivered impacts that resonated through the heavy bag with surprising force. Her stance was textbook perfect, her combinations flowing with a fluidity that made the other recruits pause in their own efforts. "Where did she learn that?" David Park asked quietly, watching Kira work through a series of strikes that looked nothing like the wild swinging most recruits employed. "Probably took some karate classes as a kid," Amanda replied dismissively, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Kane approached Kira's station, watching her technique with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of recruits try and fail to master basic combat skills. Her footwork was exceptional, her balance perfect. When she threw a combination, every movement flowed into the next with mechanical precision. "Where did you train?" Kane asked suddenly. Kira paused mid-strike, meeting his gaze directly. "Various places, Instructor Kane." Her answer was deliberately vague, but something in her tone suggested depths that the other recruits had not yet glimpsed. Kane studied her for a long moment before moving on to critique the sloppy technique of the next recruit. As the morning exercises continued, a pattern emerged. In tests of pure strength and size, Kira performed adequately, but not exceptionally. But in exercises requiring technique, precision, or endurance, she excelled in ways that began to make her fellow recruits uncomfortable. The mess hall buzzed with the aggressive energy of recruits trying to establish dominance through volume and swagger. Kira sat alone at the far end of a long table, methodically eating her regulation meal, while conversations swirled around her like hostile currents. Marcus Thorne held court at the center table, his voice carrying across the room as he regaled his growing audience with theories about their morning training. "That rope climbing thing was just physics," he declared, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. "Less weight means easier climb. Put her on something that requires real strength and watch her crumble." Amanda chin nodded enthusiastically from her position at his right hand. "Exactly. Anyone can look good when the exercise is practically designed for their body type. Wait until we get to the real stuff." Jake Morrison, still nursing his ego from his poor push-up performance, found validation in joining the criticism. "I bet those combat strikes were just for show too. Probably learned some moves from watching movies or something." The laughter that followed was harsh and deliberate, designed to carry across the room to where Kira sat. She continued eating without acknowledging the comments, but David Park, sitting 2 tables away, noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Later that afternoon, during equipment inspection, the harassment became more direct. Marcus positioned himself near Kira's locker as she organized her gear, his massive frame casting a shadow over her workspace. "Having trouble reaching the top shelf, Tiny?" he asked with mock concern. "Maybe they should have issued you a stepladder along with your uniform." Amanda appeared at his shoulder, emboldened by his presence. "I heard they have special accommodations for people who cannot meet the physical standards. Maybe you should look into those programs instead of wasting everyone's time here." The comment drew a crowd of onlookers, recruits who might have normally focused on their own preparations now drawn to the entertainment of watching someone else become a target. Kira continued arranging her equipment with methodical precision, giving no indication that she heard their comments. "You know what I think?" Marcus continued, his voice gaining confidence from the audience. "I think you're going to get someone killed out there. When bullets start flying, the last thing we need is dead weight slowing us down." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Several recruits shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Marcus had crossed a line from mockery into something more serious. But the pack mentality was strong, and nobody stepped forward to challenge him. Instructor Kane appeared in the doorway like a materializing storm cloud. His weathered face surveyed the gathered crowd with the expression of someone who had seen this particular drama play out countless times before. "What exactly are we discussing here?" Kane asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made even Marcus take a step back. "Just getting to know our fellow recruits, Instructor Kane," Marcus replied, his earlier bravado suddenly tempered with caution. Kane's eyes moved slowly across the faces in the crowd before settling on Kira, who had continued organizing her gear throughout the entire exchange. Something in her posture, the controlled way she moved, seemed to catch his attention. "Vasquez," Kane called out. Front and center, Kira closed her locker and approached without hesitation, her small frame moving through the crowd of larger recruits who parted reluctantly before her. She stopped exactly 3 feet from Kane and stood at attention, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "Tomorrow we start hand-to-hand combat training," Kane announced to the room, but his eyes remained fixed on Kira. "Everyone will get a chance to demonstrate their skills against a partner. Vasquez, you will be paired with Thorn for the first demonstration." The announcement sent a ripple of excited whispers through the crowd. Marcus grinned broadly, already savoring what he saw as an opportunity to publicly humiliate the recruit who had somehow managed to show him up during the morning exercises. "Should be interesting," Marcus muttered to Amanda, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hope the medic is standing by." Kane dismissed the group, but as the recruits filed out, he noticed something that made him pause. Kira had not reacted to the pairing announcement with fear or resignation. Instead, there had been the briefest flicker of something else in her expression, something that looked almost like anticipation. That evening, as the barracks settled into the routine of equipment maintenance and letter writing, the conversation inevitably returned to the next day's demonstration. Bets were quietly made, odds calculated based on size differential and perceived experience. Dawn broke over Fort Meridian with the color of old blood, casting long shadows across the combat training mat, where 43 recruits gathered in a loose circle. The air thrummed with anticipation and barely contained excitement as word of the demonstration had spread through the barracks like wildfire during the night. Instructor Kane stood at the edge of the mat, his scarred hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the eager faces surrounding him. "Today you learn that size and strength mean nothing without technique and discipline," he announced, his voice cutting through the morning air with practiced authority. Marcus Thorne stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his physical superiority. At 6 feet 4 inches and 230 pounds of muscle built through years of high school football and weekend gym sessions, he moved with the swagger of a man who saw the upcoming demonstration as little more than sanctioned entertainment. Kira emerged from the crowd like a shadow, gaining substance, her small frame appearing almost ethereal against the concrete backdrop of the training facility. She wore the same regulation gear as everyone else, but somehow managed to look even smaller in the standard-issue clothing that seemed designed for larger bodies. The spectators pressed closer, forming a tight ring around the mat. Amanda Chan positioned herself at the front, her phone discreetly angled to capture what she expected would be a humiliating defeat. Jake Morrison stood beside her, already composing the story he would tell his friends back home about the day a tiny recruit got put in her place. "Remember the rules," Kane called out as the two combatants faced each other on the mat. "This is about technique demonstration, not domination. First person to achieve a controlling position or submission hold wins the round." Marcus rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles with theatrical flourish. The sound echoed across the training ground like breaking branches. He looked down at Kira with the bemused expression of someone trying to figure out how to handle a situation that seemed almost comically unfair. "You sure about this, Tiny?" he asked with mock concern. "I would hate to accidentally hurt you in front of everyone." The comment drew snickers from the crowd, but Kira simply nodded to Kane, indicating she was ready to begin. Her stance was relaxed, balanced, with her weight distributed evenly on the balls of her feet. To most observers, she looked like a child preparing to play a game she could never win. Kane raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. "Begin." Marcus lunged forward with the aggressive confidence of someone who expected to end the demonstration quickly. His strategy was simple and brutal. Use his size advantage to overwhelm his opponent before she could employ whatever limited technique she might possess. But as his massive hands reached for Kira, something extraordinary happened. She moved. It was not the frantic scrambling of someone trying to escape inevitable defeat, nor the wild flailing of panic. Instead, Kira flowed like water around Marcus's attack, her small frame shifting with fluid precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics governing larger bodies. Marcus's hands closed on empty air as Kira materialized behind him, her movements so smooth and economical that several spectators blinked in confusion, unsure of how she had managed to change positions so quickly. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered, spinning around to face his opponent who now stood calmly 3 feet away, her expression unchanged, her breathing still controlled and even. The crowd fell silent, the expected quick victory suddenly seeming less certain. Amanda lowered her phone slightly, her confident smile beginning to waver as she processed what she had just witnessed. Kane watched with growing interest, his experienced eye recognizing movement patterns that spoke of training far beyond what any civilian should possess. The way Kira had avoided Marcus's initial attack was not lucky evasion, but precise technique executed with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of disciplined practice. Marcus attacked again, this time with more caution but greater determination. He had been embarrassed by his first failed attempt and was determined not to let a recruit half his size make him look foolish in front of their peers. But again, Kira simply was not where his attack expected her to be. She moved with the effortless grace of someone who understood combat at a level that transcended mere physical training. The demonstration stretched beyond what anyone had expected, transforming from anticipated entertainment into something far more unsettling. Marcus, breathing heavily now, circled Kira like a frustrated predator who could not understand why his prey refused to behave according to the natural order. "She is just running away," Amanda whispered to Jake, but her voice carried less conviction than before. The confidence that had marked her earlier commentary was beginning to crack as she watched Kira move with a precision that seemed to mock everything they thought they understood about combat. Marcus lunged again, this time committing his full weight to a tackle that should have been impossible for someone Kira's size to avoid. But at the last possible moment, she shifted her stance and redirected his momentum with a subtle movement that sent him stumbling past her and nearly into the crowd of spectators. The recruits scrambled backward, their laughter dying as they began to realize they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. What had started as a demonstration was becoming something else entirely, something that made them question their assumptions about strength and weakness. Kane stepped forward slightly, his weathered face showing the first signs of genuine surprise he had displayed since the training began. The way Kira had redirected Marcus's attack was not luck or evasion, but a sophisticated application of leverage and timing that required years of training to master. "Enough running," Marcus growled, his face flushed with exertion and embarrassment. "Stand still and fight like a soldier." But even as he spoke, something in his eyes suggested he was beginning to understand that he was not facing the helpless opponent he had expected. Kira's movements were too controlled, too precise, too obviously the product of training that went far beyond anything a civilian recruit should possess. Kira finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the silent training ground. "I am not running," she said simply, her breathing still controlled despite the extended engagement. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus responded with renewed aggression. He came at her with a combination of strikes and grappling attempts that would have overwhelmed most opponents through sheer ferocity. But Kira continued to flow around his attacks like smoke, never quite where his hands expected her to be. Instructor Kane found himself leaning forward, studying Kira's technique with the focused attention of someone recognizing excellence when he saw it. Her footwork was flawless, her balance perfect. Every movement served a purpose, whether defensive or positional. She was not just avoiding Marcus's attacks. She was controlling the entire engagement. The crowd had fallen completely silent now, their earlier jeers and laughter replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something extraordinary. David Park stood transfixed, his earlier quiet defense of Kira suddenly seeming prophetic rather than naive. "How is she doing that?" someone whispered from the back of the crowd, but nobody answered because nobody had an explanation that made sense within their understanding of how combat was supposed to work. Marcus was beginning to tire, his attacks becoming more desperate and less coordinated. Sweat poured down his face as he tried unsuccessfully to land even a glancing blow on his elusive opponent. His confidence was evaporating with each failed attempt, replaced by a growing frustration that bordered on panic. Kira, by contrast, showed no signs of fatigue. Her movements remained crisp and economical, her breathing steady. It was becoming clear to the more observant spectators that she was holding back, that whatever skills she possessed were not being displayed at their full extent. Kane called a halt to the demonstration with a sharp whistle that cut through the tension like a blade. Both combatants stepped back, but the contrast between them was stark. Marcus bent over with his hands on his knees, gulping air and trying to process what had just happened to his self-image. Kira simply stood at attention, waiting for further instructions. The silence stretched uncomfortably as 42 recruits tried to reconcile what they had just witnessed with their preconceptions about size, strength, and military capability. Their worldview had been quietly but thoroughly challenged, and none of them were quite sure how to process the implications. The afternoon brought no relief from the tension that had settled over the recruit company like a suffocating blanket. In the mess hall, conversations died whenever Kira approached, replaced by uncomfortable stares and whispered speculation that followed her like shadows. Marcus sat hunched over his meal, his earlier swagger replaced by something darker and more dangerous. The humiliation of the morning demonstration had fermented into resentment, and his followers sensed the change in their leader like pack animals detecting weakness in their alpha. "This is not over," Marcus muttered to Amanda, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose entire identity had been called into question. "Nobody makes me look like a fool and gets away with it." Amanda nodded eagerly, desperate to maintain her position in the social hierarchy that seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. Maybe she got lucky this morning, but luck runs out eventually. Jake Morrison leaned across the table, his farm boy features twisted with confusion and anger. There is something wrong about her. Normal people do not move like that. Maybe she's on some kind of drugs or something. The theory spread through their group like wildfire because it offered an explanation that allowed them to maintain their worldview. If Kira's performance was the result of artificial enhancement rather than genuine skill, then their humiliation became more bearable. Later that evening, as the barracks settled into the routine of equipment maintenance and preparation for the next day, Marcus made his move. He approached Kira's bunk with 3 of his closest followers, their footsteps deliberately heavy on the polished floor. "We need to talk," he said, positioning himself so that his massive frame blocked Kira from easy exit. The other recruits in the immediate area suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, leaving the confrontation space that felt both public and private. Kira looked up from cleaning her rifle, her dark eyes meeting Marcus's angry stare without flinching. She set down the cleaning rod with deliberate care and stood, her small frame dwarfed by the 4 larger recruits surrounding her. "I know what you are," Marcus continued, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the barracks. "You're some kind of ringer brought in to make the rest of us look bad. Maybe you're special forces or something, pretending to be a regular recruit." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and several other recruits stopped their activities to listen. The idea that Kira might not be what she appeared offered a compelling explanation for the morning's events. "I'm exactly what I appear to be," Kira replied quietly. "A recruit, same as everyone else here." Amanda stepped forward, emboldened by Marcus's presence. "Nobody believes that anymore. Regular people do not move the way you moved this morning. You made Marcus look like an amateur, and he has been training his whole life." The statement revealed more than Amanda intended, acknowledging Kira's superiority while simultaneously trying to explain it away. But the logic was flawed, and the more perceptive recruits recognized the contradiction inherent in her argument. Jake Morrison added his voice to the confrontation. "You're going to get people killed out there. When the shooting starts, we need to know that everyone has our backs. How can we trust someone who is lying about who they really are?" The accusation of dishonesty struck deeper than the questions about her abilities. Military culture was built on trust between soldiers, and suggesting that trust had been violated was a serious charge that could not be ignored. Instructor Kane appeared at the far end of the barracks, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. He moved through the space with the measured pace of someone who had intervened in countless similar situations, his experienced eye taking in the body language and positioning that told him everything he needed to know about what was happening. "Problem here?" Kane asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made even Marcus step back slightly. "No problem, Instructor Kane," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just having a conversation with our fellow recruit about tomorrow's training exercises." Kane's weathered face showed no expression, but his eyes moved between the faces of the confrontation participants with the analytical precision of someone reading a tactical situation. He had seen this pattern before, the way mediocrity tried to tear down excellence when it could not understand or accept it. "Tomorrow we increase the intensity of training," Kane announced to the entire barracks. "Hand-to-hand combat will be followed by advanced tactical exercises. Everyone will have multiple opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities." The promise carried implications that made both sides of the confrontation pause to consider what increased intensity might mean for their respective positions. Morning arrived at Fort Meridian with the weight of unresolved tension pressing down on the recruit company like an approaching storm. The atmosphere in the mess hall crackled with anticipation as 43 young men and women prepared for what everyone sensed would be a defining moment in their training. Instructor Kane entered the dining facility with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision during the long night hours. His weathered face betrayed nothing, but the clipboard in his hands and the slight change in his usual routine suggested that today's training would deviate from the standard curriculum. "Listen up, maggots," Kane announced, his voice cutting through the morning chatter like a blade. "Today we conduct advanced combat assessments. Real scenarios, real pressure, real consequences for failure." The recruits exchanged glances, their breakfast suddenly tasting like cardboard as the implications sank in. Advanced assessments typically came weeks later in training, after recruits had been properly conditioned and prepared for the intensity. Marcus straightened in his chair, his confidence returning as he contemplated a chance to redeem himself from yesterday's humiliation. Whatever tricks Kira had employed during their demonstration would be useless in real combat scenarios designed to test genuine military capability. Amanda leaned toward Jake Morrison, her voice barely above a whisper. Finally, she's going to get exposed for whatever she really is. Kane continued his announcement, his eyes scanning the faces before him with the analytical precision of someone taking inventory. Each recruit will face multiple combat scenarios designed to test tactical thinking, physical capability, and mental resilience under pressure. The training ground had been transformed overnight into a series of interconnected obstacle courses and simulation areas. Smoke machines created a hazy battlefield atmosphere, while speakers hidden throughout the area provided the constant background noise of distant artillery and small arms fire. Kira found herself assigned to the most challenging course, a decision that Kane made with deliberate intent. If she was indeed what Marcus suspected, a trained operator masquerading as a recruit, then this course would force her to reveal her true capabilities to survive it. The course itself was a nightmare of physical and tactical challenges designed to break recruits who were not ready for advanced training. Rope climbs led to narrow balance beams suspended 15 feet above concrete. Shooting galleries required precision marksmanship while under physical stress. Hand-to-hand combat stations featured multiple opponents attacking simultaneously. Marcus volunteered to observe Kira's run through the course, positioning himself with several other recruits at vantage points that would allow them to witness what he expected would be her inevitable failure and exposure as a fraud. "Your course begins in 30 seconds, Kane announced, his stopwatch held prominently in his weathered hand. Failure at any station means immediate course termination and remedial training assignment. The implications were clear. Failure would not just mean embarrassment, but potential removal from the regular training program and assignment to remedial courses reserved for recruits who could not meet standard military requirements. Kira stood at the starting line, her small frame appearing almost fragile against the intimidating backdrop of the obstacle course. The other recruits pressed closer to the viewing areas, their conversations dying as the moment of truth approached. Kane raised his hand, the gesture commanding absolute silence from the gathered spectators. The morning air thrummed with tension as everyone prepared to witness what they expected would be either a spectacular failure or a revelation that would change everything they thought they understood about their fellow recruit. "Begin," Kane called sharply, dropping his hand. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every person present for the rest of their military careers. Kira exploded into motion with a speed and precision that defied every assumption about human capability that the spectators possessed. She flowed through the initial obstacles like liquid lightning, her small frame moving with an efficiency that made the course appear designed specifically for someone with her exact capabilities. Rope climbs that challenged the strongest recruits became mere formalities. Balance beams that required careful concentration became highways for her precise footwork. Marcus watched in growing horror as every obstacle that should have broken her instead became a showcase for abilities that no civilian recruit should possess. His theory about performance-enhancing drugs crumbled as he witnessed technique that could only come from years of the most advanced military training available. The shooting gallery section of the course revealed the next level of Kira's hidden capabilities. While running at full speed and breathing heavily from the previous obstacles, she transitioned seamlessly to the weapons station, where targets appeared and disappeared at random intervals requiring split-second decisions and perfect marksmanship. Her first shots rang out with mechanical precision, each round finding its mark despite the physical stress and time pressure that would have challenged even experienced soldiers. The targets were designed to test combat accuracy under duress, but Kira engaged them with the calm efficiency of someone for whom such challenges had become routine. Amanda Chun watched from her observation point with growing unease, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "That is not normal recruit marksmanship," she whispered to Jake Morrison, who stood beside her with his mouth hanging open in shocked recognition. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched Kira move through the combat scenarios with fluid grace that spoke of training far beyond anything available to civilian recruits. Every movement was economical, purposeful, and devastatingly effective. The hand-to-hand combat section featured 3 instructors acting as opponents, a scenario designed to overwhelm recruits and force them to think tactically while under physical pressure. Most recruits who reached this section would be expected to demonstrate basic defensive techniques while being systematically defeated by superior numbers and experience. But Kira did not engage the scenario like a recruit trying to survive an overwhelming challenge. Instead, she moved through the 3 opponents like a predator among prey, her strikes precise and devastating. The first instructor found himself on the ground before he fully understood how she had closed the distance. The second managed to throw a single punch before discovering that his arm was trapped in a joint lock that threatened to dislocate his shoulder. The third instructor, a veteran of multiple combat deployments, lasted exactly 4 seconds before Kira had him immobilized with a chokehold that he recognized from the most advanced special operations training programs. Kane watched the demonstration with the growing realization that he was witnessing skills that surpassed his own considerable combat experience. The techniques Kira employed were not just advanced, they were the kind of precision fighting systems taught only in the most classified military programs. Holy hell! One of the observing recruits breathed, his voice barely audible above the background noise of the training facility. The final section of the course featured a tactical decision-making scenario where recruits had to navigate a simulated building clearing operation while making split-second choices about target identification and engagement priorities. The scenario was designed to be nearly impossible for untrained recruits, requiring the kind of tactical thinking that came only from real combat experience. Kira moved through the building like a ghost, her small frame allowing her to utilize cover and concealment in ways that larger operators could not. She cleared each room with textbook precision, her weapon handling and tactical movement revealing training that went far beyond basic military instruction. Kane found himself taking notes not on her performance deficiencies, but on techniques he wanted to study and potentially incorporate into advanced training programs. What he was witnessing was not a recruit struggling through challenging exercises, but an operator conducting a flawless demonstration of skills that took years to master. David Park stood transfixed at his observation point, finally understanding why he had instinctively defended Kira against the earlier criticisms. Some part of him had recognized that she was not what she appeared to be, even when he could not articulate why he felt that way. The course concluded with a final obstacle that required recruits to rappel down a 40-foot tower while under simulated fire, a test of nerve and technical skill that eliminated many recruits from advanced training programs. Kira descended the tower with the controlled precision of someone who had performed similar maneuvers under actual combat conditions. Her technique flawless despite the physical exhaustion that should have accumulated from the previous challenges. Kane clicked his stopwatch as Kira crossed the finish line, her time not just beating the previous record, but shattering it by margins that seemed impossible for someone her size. She stood at attention, her breathing controlled despite having just completed a course that would have broken most experienced soldiers. The silence that followed was absolute. 42 recruits and multiple instructors trying to process what they had just witnessed. Every assumption, every joke, every moment of mockery was suddenly recontextualized in light of capabilities that defied comprehension. The silence stretched across the training ground like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating in its completeness. Kane stared at his stopwatch, checking the numbers twice before looking up at Kira with an expression that mixed professional admiration with growing suspicion. "Vasquez," he called out, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet. Front and center. Kira approached with the same controlled precision she had displayed throughout the course, but now every movement carried new weight in the eyes of the spectators. What had once appeared as simple economy of motion was now clearly the product of training that went far beyond civilian experience. That was not recruit-level performance, Kane stated flatly, his weathered face showing the kind of intensity reserved for moments when everything he thought he understood was being called into question. The gathered recruits pressed closer, their earlier mockery replaced by an almost fearful fascination. Marcus stood frozen at his observation point, his face pale as he processed the implications of what he had just witnessed. Kane continued his interrogation with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years identifying deception. The techniques you just demonstrated are not taught in basic training. They're not taught in advanced infantry school. Some of what I saw is classified instruction available only to Tier 1 Special Operations units. Kira met his gaze directly, her dark eyes revealing nothing of whatever calculations were occurring behind them. The moment had arrived when her carefully maintained facade could no longer be sustained, but her response would determine how that revelation unfolded. "I trained before enlisting, Instructor Kane," she replied quietly, her voice carrying across the silent training ground with crystalline clarity. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, confirming what everyone now suspected, but creating more questions than it answered. Kane leaned forward slightly, his professional curiosity overriding his instructor persona. "Where did you train, and with whom?" Kane demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be satisfied with evasive answers. Kira was quiet for a long moment, her small frame utterly still as she weighed her options. When she finally spoke, her words would shatter every remaining assumption the recruits held about strength, capability, and the nature of the person they had dismissed as deadweight. "Special Activities Division," she said simply. 8 years active duty. 3 combat deployments. Medically retired after taking shrapnel in Afghanistan. The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Special Activities Division was legendary even among military personnel, a unit so classified that most soldiers knew it only through whispered rumors and secondhand stories. The operators who served in SAD were considered the elite among the elite, individuals whose capabilities bordered on the mythical. Amanda Chun felt her legs go weak as she processed what Kira had just revealed. She had spent weeks mocking someone whose combat experience surpassed that of most career military personnel, whose training had been conducted at levels of classification she could never hope to access. Jake Morrison stumbled backward, his farm boy confidence completely shattered as he realized he had questioned the military credentials of someone who had served in operations he would never be clear to know existed. But it was Marcus who displayed the most dramatic reaction. The massive recruit who had built his identity around physical dominance and military aspirations found himself face to face with the reality that he had attempted to intimidate someone whose actual combat experience made his high school football achievements appear childish by comparison. Kane studied Kira with new eyes, his trained gaze now recognizing the subtle indicators he had missed during her initial assessment. The perfect posture that came from years of military discipline. The controlled breathing that spoke of stress inoculation training. The economy of movement that characterized operators who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. "Why are you here?" Kane asked, his voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of authority. "Why would someone with your background and experience choose to go through basic training again?" The question that everyone wanted answered but had been afraid to ask. Kira's response would provide the final piece of a puzzle that had been confounding them since her arrival. "Because I want to serve again," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that spoke of deeper motivations. "The medical retirement was not my choice. This is my chance to prove I can still contribute." The honesty in her voice was unmistakable, revealing depths of character that made her earlier tolerance of mockery and harassment take on entirely new meaning. She had not been weak or afraid. She had been restraining capabilities that could have ended any confrontation in seconds, choosing instead to endure humiliation rather than reveal skills that would have fundamentally altered the training dynamic. The weight of Kira's revelation settled over the training ground like a heavy blanket, transforming the social dynamics that had governed the recruit company for weeks. Marcus stood paralyzed at his observation point, his earlier swagger replaced by the horrified realization that he had spent weeks trying to intimidate someone who could have ended him without breaking stride. Kane processed the information with the methodical precision of a career military professional, his mind cataloging the implications of having a Special Activities Division operator in his basic training program. He had trained thousands of recruits over his career, but never had he encountered someone whose classified experience surpassed his own. 8 years SAD, 3 combat deployments, Kane repeated slowly, as if testing the words for their reality. That puts you in a very exclusive category, Vasquez. There are maybe 200 people in the world with your background and clearance level. The other recruits exchanged stunned glances, finally understanding why Kira had moved through their challenges with such apparent ease. What they had interpreted as luck or unusual fitness was actually the measured performance of someone operating at a fraction of her true capability. Amanda Chun felt physically ill as she remembered her countless comments about Kira's unsuitability for military service. She had questioned the combat readiness of someone who had already served in operations she could never be cleared to know existed, who had faced real enemies while Amanda was still in high school worrying about prom dates. David Park found himself vindicated in ways he had never expected, his quiet defense of Kira now appearing prophetic rather than naive. Some instinct had told him there was more to her story, and that instinct had proven correct in the most dramatic possible way. Kane addressed the assembled recruits with a gravity appropriate to the moment. What you witnessed today should teach you something about assumptions and the danger of judging capability based on appearance. Operator Vasquez has more combat experience than everyone here combined, including the instructional staff. The formal acknowledgement of her true status sent ripples through the crowd. She was no longer Recruit Vasquez, but Operator Vasquez, a title that carried implications about training, experience, and capability that fundamentally altered how everyone present would view her going forward. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I tried to fight you," he said, the horror evident in his tone as he processed what could have happened if Kira had chosen to respond to his challenges with her full capabilities. Kira turned to face him directly, her expression showing neither anger nor satisfaction, but rather a kind of weary understanding. "You were never in any real danger," she replied simply. "I have no interest in hurting fellow soldiers." The statement revealed the restraint she had exercised throughout their interactions, the conscious choice to endure harassment rather than demonstrate capabilities that would have traumatized civilian recruits who had never faced real violence. Jake Morrison stepped forward with the awkward determination of someone trying to salvage what remained of his dignity. "We did not know," he said, as if that explanation could somehow undo weeks of mockery directed at someone whose service record dwarfed anything he might achieve in a full military career. Kane interrupted before the apologies could continue, his instructor instincts taking over. "This experience should teach all of you about respect, assumption, and the importance of focusing on your own development rather than tearing down others." Operator Vasquez chose not to reveal her background because she wanted to be treated as an equal, not as someone whose experience gave her special status. The lesson was clear, but the damage to the social hierarchy that had governed the recruit company was irreversible. Marcus, who had positioned himself as the natural leader based on physical size and athletic background, now found that foundation completely undermined by the presence of someone whose actual leadership experience included operations he could not imagine. Amanda discovered that her role as social enforcer and judge of military suitability had been based on ignorance, so complete it bordered on the comical. Her criticisms of Kira's readiness for military service now seemed like a child questioning the qualifications of a master craftsman. The revelation created a fundamental shift in group dynamics that went beyond simple embarrassment. The recruits were forced to confront their own assumptions about strength, capability, and what it meant to be a soldier. Everything they thought they understood about military culture and hierarchy had been quietly challenged by someone they had dismissed as irrelevant. Kira remained at attention throughout the discussion, her posture perfect and her expression neutral. But for those who looked closely, there was something in her eyes that suggested relief at no longer having to maintain the fiction that had governed her interactions for weeks. The burden of hiding her true capabilities while enduring constant questioning of her military suitability had finally been lifted. 3 weeks after the revelation, Fort Meridian had become a different place entirely. The recruit company that had once been fractured by petty hierarchies and cruel mockery now operated with the disciplined cohesion that Kane had spent years trying to instill in his trainees. Kira moved through the training facility with the same quiet precision she had always displayed, but now her fellow recruits watched her with the respectful attention reserved for someone whose expertise could mean the difference between life and death in real combat situations. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Marcus approached her after the final training exercise of the day, his massive frame somehow appearing smaller than it had when he had wielded it as a weapon of intimidation. The swagger that had defined his personality had been replaced by something deeper and more valuable. Genuine humility born of understanding his own limitations. "Operator Vasquez," he said formally, using the title that Kane had established as appropriate. "I want to thank you for the restraint you showed during our conflicts. A lesser person might have made different choices about how to respond to my behavior." Kira studied his face, recognizing the genuine transformation that had occurred in the weeks following her revelation. The arrogant bully who had tormented her had evolved into someone who understood that true strength came from discipline and service rather than physical dominance. "We are all learning here, Marcus," she replied, using his first name for the first time. "Your leadership skills have improved considerably since you began focusing on helping others succeed rather than proving your own superiority." The acknowledgement meant more to Marcus than any praise he had received in his life, coming as it did from someone whose opinion carried the weight of actual combat experience. He had discovered that earning respect from someone who truly deserved respect was infinitely more valuable than commanding fear from those who were vulnerable. Amanda Chun had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone in the company. Her role as social enforcer had evolved into something far more positive as she channeled her organizational skills into helping struggling recruits master techniques that Kira had quietly taught her during evening study sessions. The evening mess hall had become a place of learning rather than social warfare, with recruits gathering around tables to discuss tactics, technique, and the mental aspects of military service. Kira often found herself at the center of these discussions, sharing insights from her experience while carefully avoiding details that remained classified. David Park sat at her table most evenings, his quiet intelligence making him an ideal student for the strategic thinking that characterized special operations planning. His early defense of Kira had earned him a special place in the group dynamic, proof that character and insight were more valuable than size or swagger. Jake Morrison had discovered that his farm background translated well into military logistics and supply chain thinking, skills that Kira helped him recognize and develop. His transformation from insecure follower to confident contributor demonstrated how the right environment could bring out capabilities that nobody had suspected. Kane observed these changes with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved something rare in military training: the creation of a recruit company that functioned as a genuine team rather than a collection of individuals competing for dominance. As graduation approached, the entire dynamic of the company had been fundamentally altered by the presence of someone who had chosen service over ego, restraint over dominance, and teaching over superiority. Kira had not just survived the harassment and mockery directed at her. She had transformed it into an opportunity to create better soldiers and better people. The final ceremony took place on a crisp morning that reminded everyone of how much had changed since that first day, when a small woman had stepped off the bus and been dismissed as deadweight by people who understood nothing about true capability. Before we conclude this story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment or character, or tell us about someone you know who showed similar hidden strength when others doubted them. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose not to display their power until the moment demands it. Kira stood in formation with her fellow graduates, No longer the isolated outsider who had endured weeks of mockery, but rather the quiet center around which a new understanding of military excellence had formed. Her presence had taught them that strength came in many forms, that assumptions were dangerous, and that true warriors were defined not by their ability to dominate others, but by their commitment to serve something greater than themselves. The lessons learned at Fort Meridian would follow these soldiers throughout their careers, a reminder that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people based on their appearance rather than their character.